Good afternoon. I'm Thomas Cucuzella in the American Horror class for Rutgers Online. For my online presentation on research, I'm going to talk about how horror has changed from its beginnings and how it's evolved and how real life events have inspired this change. Quick overview of horror as far as a genre goes in film. Kind of started out in the 1900s, the 1920s. Many of these movies were based off of classical works, things like Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde were the source material for the original movies. In the 1920s and 1930s is where we start seeing some of the classics as we know today. The 1931 Frankenstein, which we watched in class, Freaks, the theme of supernatural horror was starting to be used as well. 1940s to 1950s, obviously World War II is happening now, and horror starts to change. The European operational theater, the war in Europe, essentially, inspired movies like War of the Worlds. And then the threat of nuclear fallout begins with the use of the atomic bomb against Japan. Many people start to fear that nuclear war will be the future for the world, and movies start to capitalize off of that. Godzilla is a prime example of radiation and mutation to become the sources of horror. 1950s and 60s, horror starts to lose its luster. A lot of the movies become low-budget films. Term of zombies and the whole subgenre of zombie movies becomes popular with George R. Romero's Night of the Living Dead and other movies that we watched of his in the class as well. 1970s and 80s, we're looking more into the supernatural side of things. Devils and demons, movies like The Exorcist and Omen, The Omen, become more popular. Supernatural occurrences like the movie Carrie or The Shining start to come through. No longer is the source material the classical books, but more novel writers like Stephen King. Their novels start to become turned into movies. So we see a visual aspect to the novels that were written. In the late 70s, Texas Chainsaw Massacre comes out, and that's what kind of pushes horror into the slasher genre. So the slasher genre really started to take off in the 80s with movies like Halloween, the Friday the 13th series, Nightmare on Elm Street, all of those classic horror movies with a masked killer or super strong killers. They spawn dozens of sequels each in their own regards, remakes up until this day as well. 1990s, the slasher genre kind of started to be overdone, and everybody was out there making the slasher genre film where people started to lose interest in horror, and parody horrors started to come out. They over-exaggerated key concepts of the slasher films to make horror movies, but still that had a humor side to them, which was definitely an interesting concept. Turn of the century, we're looking at zombie movies becoming popular again. Books like World War Z became very successful, so the movies subsequently came out after that. Dawn of the Dead remakes, I Am Legend, the Resident Evil video game and movie franchise were very popular during this time. And then movies like Zombieland, again getting back into that horror comedy, where there is an overtone of comedy throughout the movie, but with horror aspects as well, especially with the zombies. 2010s and beyond, we're starting to see a lot of remakes and sequels of movies, not just in horror, but in Hollywood in general. Every movie seems to be, remastered or a new take on a classic movie, where it's starting to feel like the horror slump of the 90s again. Movies like Cabin in the Woods, they tried to take the success of Scream, and where they would over exaggerate, that's probably not the right word, but they would embellish on the cliches of horror and they would make a very successful movie out of it, in my opinion. Um, but as far as what movies have been inspired by, humans by nature are aggressive. They're violent creatures, and we want to see those things in our movies, and then real world things that have happened have inspired the horror genre to change. And not even just at the time that they happened, but decades later. Big key events actually, or events and people, key players since the beginning of horror. World War II, there was atrocities throughout World War II that people still talk about today. Horrible, horrible things that were happening. Um, Millions of people dying both on the battlefield and in terrible camps across the world. So obviously the Nazis had their concentration camps and their human experimentation. The Japanese also did as well. So movies like Overlord, which is a newer movie, turn of the decade movie, depicts Nazis' development of a super soldier, but where they would test on a local French village. They would take people from the village and test upon them, which isn't exactly what the Nazis were doing during World War II, but the atrocities that they committed during the war were used to inspire these movies. The Holocaust in general, movies like Shutter Island with Leonardo DiCaprio are used as almost a PTSD event for the character, where he slowly slips into mental instability, and again, is a big part of the entire movie. And then the nuclear war threat that exists. Again, we touched on this before, but movies like Godzilla, The Hills Have Eyes, they all stem from nuclear testing done by the Americans during World War II, where the radiation causes genetic mutations into creatures or people that become the horror villains, essentially. Um, Moving on from there, war is obviously something that's always been terrible. The big conflicts that arise across the globe generally have big impacts on the media and things like that. The war in Vietnam is often, it's not exactly a pleasant experience that anybody likes to talk about. And the movie Texas Chainsaw Massacre has been described as an analogy for the war, where young Americans are sent and slaughtered for what seems like no reason. Just complete carnage, which is where the movie gets some of its inspiration from. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is actually one of the key movies in this whole thing. It's inspired by a lot of different aspects. Movies like Apocalypse Now, although not generally a horror movie, more of a war film, but it does show the mental anguish that many soldiers and Marines, people fighting over in Vietnam experienced, where they would slip into these states of, almost subhuman interactions with each other. They didn't seem to be people anymore, which is a terrible thing. Key people who have inspired horror to change. Ed Gein was a big name that came up during my research. He was a serial killer from Wisconsin, and he had a lot of interesting attributes. He had a deep obsession with his mother. His father was an alcoholic who beat him as a child, so he adored his mother. And he began to murder people in the area, and he was actually a cannibal, and he used human remains for artwork in his own home. So obviously some of those things sound very familiar. Psycho was inspired by Ed Gein. The obsession with the mother is something that Alfred Hitchcock used as a key part of Norman Bates' character development. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, again, was inspired by Ed Gein, among other things. The cannibalistic side of things was something that they took from, a small farmhouse in the middle of nowhere where people were being killed and eaten by a masked man. And Silence of the Lambs is another movie that cannibalism is the subject matter, where people are murdered and consumed by somebody. Ed Gein wasn't a very particularly smart man, so that's where Silence of the Lambs diverts from the source material but again, a great movie as well. And the final person that really inspired horror was Ronald DeFeo Jr. That name may not sound familiar to many people, but I'm sure the name Amityville is. So Ronald uh, was the real life Amityville killer. He went and he killed his entire family, 6 family members, with a rifle one night, and he claimed that voices in his head that he had heard of his family members, they were going to plot to hurt him. So he took it upon himself to attack and defend himself by murdering his entire family in cold blood. And then obviously that inspired the entire Amityville horror series, which has almost a dozen iterations within itself at this point. So clearly, people in Hollywood, they can think of their own ideas, but a lot of times it's easier just to watch the news and to see what's going on in the world, and those can be just sources of horror. Humans can do terrible things to one another, and deep down inside, that's why we watch horror, is to be scared, to be chilled, and to know that some of these things may have actually happened to individuals is something that, to me at least personally, brings a great sense of horror to know that maybe the character and the actor in the film isn't being hurt, but somewhere out there, someone actually did go through that traumatic experience, that horrible experience, and was hurt. So, thank you very much for watching. I look forward to answering anybody's questions that they might have about the topic, and have a great day.